Kevin and Adam said my name is Luke Askew. I am a developer here at Dynamit up on the third floor, and now I'm here at Dynamit with Adam, and yeah, that's about all you need to know about me. Also, what sort of got me interested in this topic of open source is a project that I started while I was at Resource called Fabricator, which is sort of like Pattern Lab, if you're familiar with that. Small little open source project that I ran, but I learned a lot through the process of running a project and getting involved in the open source community. So that's what led me to sort of talk about this topic, because I thought it was really interesting and that you guys would be interested in hearing some of those things that I learned along the way. So tonight I want to talk about what open source is, sort of where it came from, where that idea of open source software came from within the software community, how to do it as an individual, how to get started if you've never participated in an open source project, some of those steps that you can take to get you to being like an active contributing member of an open source community, and how to run your own project. So I'm going to talk about some of the things that I've learned. I'm by no means an expert in running an open source project, but I have learned a few things and seen a few things other projects did that I liked. And if you're thinking about starting a project or releasing something open source, I've got a few tips that might be helpful to you. So I think, also, before I get started, if you have any questions at any time, you just want to like raise your hand and say something, by all means, just interrupt me. This is really just sort of like a conversation. I'm just talking about some of the things that I've learned. If you guys have questions and want to take the conversation in a different direction, feel free to just shoot your hand up and ask the question. Don't be shy. So I want to start by sort of giving you a definition of what open source software is. Hopefully we've all heard that term before, but I pulled this definition from the body of people that sort of started this whole open source. They coined the term open source, the Open Source Initiative. And they define it as software that can be freely used, changed, and shared by anybody. And they coined that term, and we'll talk about this a little bit later, right after Mozilla opened their source. What was formerly the Netscape Navigator became the Mozilla, or the Navigator Mozilla platform that was open sourced. They coined this term, open source, and they provided some definitions around what that meant. But at its core, it's really this idea of sharing information, freely collaborating with people, sharing information, sharing the things that you've built with other people so that you can learn from each other. And that idea is really not something that's unique to software. It's really not unique to the internet at all. It's something that goes really hand in hand with some ideas in economics, really, that talk about how economies thrive when there's this free flow of information and open exchange of ideas and information. And computing just seemed to really latch onto that idea, and it has done great things for it. So early on, that was like the idea of sharing. Well, that's a really pixelated image. This idea of like sharing information with each other between early computer researchers was like crucial. Like at institutions like Stanford and MIT, they would share information and research back and forth so they could progress where computing was going. And actually the internet was a network first developed for the purpose of sharing ideas back and forth, this free flow of ideas and information back and forth. But as computing progressed and got more and more mature, it moved out of like academia into commercialization. And in the 70s and 80s, it really started to get to this point where software creators and developers were closing their source. They moved from being open and sharing ideas to not sharing their source, not sharing their ideas, and charging people fees and adding copyrights to their code. And one particular, and specifically, Richard Stallman, who's known as like the father of this free software movement, sort of pioneered this idea of free software. And it's not free as in like you don't have to pay for it, but it's free as in freedom. That he thought that when people that distributed software closed their source and didn't expose how things are made and didn't allow him to modify things, that it was immoral, that he felt restricted, that he didn't have the freedom to develop software, and it really went against the grain of this idea of sharing ideas and collaborating with each other, and that this whole idea of closing off source and not allowing people to participate and understand how software works and change software would destroy the software, the hacker community. So he coined this term, free software, and along with it, developed this idea of the 4 freedoms. And the 4 freedoms that he said is that software, you should have the freedom to run programs for any purpose. That you should be able to study how a program works. You should be able to modify it to fit your needs. You should be able to redistribute copies however you want, and distribute copies back to the community so that you can share the things that you learned and the things that you modified so that the community could grow and that we could all learn and progress forward and share these ideas. And he, to support this, drafted the GNU license, the GPL, if you're familiar with that term, the GNU General Public License, and the term copyleft. So it's like this, he took the concept of copyright and just like flipped it on its head, saying that if you used software under the GPL, that you have to allow people to use it, that you can't restrict access to it, that you have to release the product and all of its source and allow people to use it under these 4 freedoms as they wish. And that was cool, and it really caught on with sort of like the really hardcore hackers in the development community, but it really never caught on with corporations and the mainstream. And this idea of free, like you can't go to a corporation like Netscape or Microsoft and say we're going to do free software. Even though he's not meaning it as like we're going to give it away for free, just that idea and all of the moral things that he attached to that term free software didn't rub well with corporations until I think it was 1998 when Mozilla decided that because of the struggles that they were having with Internet Explorer, that they would have to do something different. They decided to open source the Navigator suite, the software, the guts behind their Navigator browser. And they formed the Mozilla organization, and they decided to release the source code for all the developers in the world to look at, understand, study, and contribute back to. Yeah, very smart. And the problem was that people within Netscape and the shareholders especially didn't like that term free software. So they needed to come up with a less sort of political term, a more marketable term for what it is that they were doing. And they also wanted to provide, they just wanted to distance themselves from that whole idea of like having to distribute everything so openly. So they coined the term open source because they thought that identified more with what they were trying to do, and they also sort of allowed some caveats into how you could commercialize some of those products. And some of those guidelines that they set out have been outlined in a bunch of different licenses that you might be familiar with. Have you guys seen these terms before? So there's tons of different licenses that have evolved out of this open source movement. Of course, we talked a little bit about the GPL, but there's the MIT, Apache, the Mozilla license, and they all have different terms. And I'm going to talk about the differences between the different licenses in a bit, but just know that there are a ton of different licenses out there, and the terms of this new sort of mainstream idea of open sourcing software, the guidelines of how to use that are outlined in these different licenses that you can attribute to your work. Any questions so far?
What is WTF?
It's I don't know. It's something crude. I don't know the exact term. It's like do whatever the F you please with it, or something. It's basically like a no copyright. It's like I don't care what you do whatever you want with it. Totally free. It has the F word in it though, so I'm not gonna say it on film.
That's an actual license.
It's like more of a tongue-in-cheek thing. I mean, all of these really are just like verbiage that you attribute to your project, but that's sort of like a tongue-in-cheek license that somebody's published. So open source, any other questions? Cool. Open source software is everywhere, and I think that marketing change that they made was a very wise decision. And I don't think that this whole idea of sharing software and ideas within software would be nearly as popular as it is if they hadn't have made that switch when Mozilla decided to go open source. So it's been very effective. And like I said, open source is everywhere. So at a high level, it's in the infrastructure of the World Wide Web. So Apache, Nginx, the HTTP server software, OpenSSL, which deals with secure connections between servers and clients, is all open source. On the desktop, there's of course Linux, which is open source. But even further than that, I'm on a Mac, so I know that utilities like Bash, awk, grep, nano, vim, swig, bzip, if you're familiar with these utilities, if you're on a Mac or Unix-based system, all of those and more are open source utilities that I use probably every day that developers before me have given freely of their time to develop. And then mobile OS, Android is the big one that's totally open source. But even on the Apple side, Apple has open sourced their language Swift, which developers use to develop iOS applications. That language itself is open source. And then WebKit, which is the browser that drives Android and iOS and even internal applications, the web-based rendering thing that is in mobile applications. What's that? I think that's like a similar name, yeah. So a level down, or a level up, whatever direction you want to go. We have Jquery. These are libraries in the development stack. These are things that I use probably every day, aside from Rails. But how many of you guys have used 2 or more of these things in this list? Or how many of you use these things every day, right? I saw some stat when I was doing some research. I think something like 70% of the top 10,000 trafficked websites in the world use Jquery, right? It's amazing. And that last one was really, these last 2 are interesting. These are actually VPNs that people in countries like China and Iran can use to get around their country's VPN or firewalls to access information. And these are all open source projects. It's actually, this Shadow Socks one just got shut down, and I think the guy maybe got arrested or in trouble for developing it. But if you go to the GitHub page, it's completely shut down because the Chinese government didn't want them to have access or to be able to circumvent the restrictions that the country had placed. And then companies doing open source. Of course, you have technology companies like Apple, Microsoft, Google, Facebook are all doing tremendous open source projects, Angular, React. Microsoft just open sourced their .NET development stack or portions of it. But then even have car companies like Tesla, which famously open sourced their patents. I found that Ford actually has some open source projects that they're running, hardware and software, which is really interesting. I just recently used a project from the NFL. The NFL has a GitHub account, and I guess they use React, and I needed some React component, and they had some great resources there. Disney open sourced a bunch of their animation plugins to Maya and things like that they use, and their animation algorithms are all open sourced. And of course, Dynamit, we open source stuff as well. Does anybody work for a company that does open source or has open source projects actively, besides Nick and Adam? That's a shame. All right, hopefully you guys can convince your company to do something. Yeah, good luck. So why do open source? I'll stop for questions here. I'm going to stop. Every time you see a photo, these photos are actually Creative Commons licensed too, so that's open and free. But every time you see one of these, I'll just stop and just pause for questions. Yep.
Where's the attribution?
At the end, the last slide.
Hey, Luke.
Yeah.
Someone asked a question if you were repeating.
Okay. He asked, where's the attribution for the photo? In the last slide. Cool. So why do open source? One, the first thing obvious to me is to feed the system. To be honest, like if you think about it, all these things that I just showed, I wouldn't have a job I wouldn't be able to function the way that I do in my job without those things and more. I mean, those are just like the tip of the iceberg of the things that I use every day, and I'm sure you guys use every day. So I wouldn't be able to function without it. Our companies certainly wouldn't be able to function without the open source community. It really sustains us, and it enables us to do creative things. We don't have to invent all of these tools. They're already available to us, and they're done really well. So it enables us and empowers us to do things. And by participating in open source, we feed back into that system that not only gave us our job in the first place, but sets up the next generation of developers to succeed. We're feeding back into that. We're not just taking and taking and taking, but we keep that momentum going, contributing ideas back to the development community at large, and we keep that going. And it's a really, really awesome thing to be a part of, and as developers, to be able to contribute back to that. So feeding the system. And then a little bit more selfishly is to develop your skills. And this is one of the things that I really learned when I first got introduced to open source, is how much you can learn. And I see a lot of younger developers here, which is awesome. If you take one thing away from this, it's this slide, is like use open source software to develop your skills. One, because it's free and you don't have to pay for it, right? You can learn from it freely. That's the whole idea. But in a lot of projects, larger projects, you get to learn from the smartest people in the world, right? The people that are the best at what they do. You get to read the things that they've done. You get to listen to the conversations that they're having and understand the decisions that they're making, which is really valuable. And you get all of that for free, which is amazing. So a few ways that I like to learn from open source is to subscribe to repos, or repositories. So hopefully everyone has a GitHub account. What I do is if there's a project that I use like all the time, or it looks interesting, I just watch it on GitHub, and every morning I come into the office and I go to my GitHub notifications, and I just look at all of the different conversations that were had. And you can go, actually, I think I'm going to try to bring it up. Is it going to let me? There we go. Yeah. So if you've never seen this page, I encourage you to get familiar with it. But there's a few projects that I follow that have pending notifications, and I just go here and read through and click on the ones that look interesting to me. And it's really, really cool to see some of the ideas that are happening. It clues me into some of the ideas that are popping up in these libraries that I use. It clues me into new technologies that are going to come up, or ideas that are shifting. And it's like I spend 10 minutes every day, and I'm on the edge of exactly what's happening. And I've got that leg up on everybody else, and I can educate people within my company, other developers, and it just makes me an even smarter developer. And it's like such a little investment of time. So I'll go back. Seamless. All right. Read through issues, like I just said. Read through issues when you encounter them. Understand, people stream of conscious, and you get to see how people think, the decisions that they're making, why they're making them. Very, very informative. Join mailing lists, and definitely like read source. Another example, real quick. I'm not going to pop over, but Bootstrap. You guys are all familiar with Bootstrap, the library. Just because of the work we do, we probably don't use it very much. I don't know if I've ever used it actually in production for something, but I leverage Bootstrap daily, probably. And what I do is, like, especially how they deal with accessibility. And I think about 2 years ago, PayPal actually forked the Bootstrap project, added a ton of accessibility things, because I guess whatever was in Bootstrap didn't meet PayPal's standards, legal requirements or whatever. So they forked it. They were using Bootstrap. They forked it, added a whole bunch of stuff that met all of their internal legal requirements, and then they did a pull request back in to the project. And now Bootstrap, I think that was like 2 years ago, Bootstrap has gone through several iterations of dealing with like the best way to handle accessibility on things like modals and tabs and drop downs. So whenever I have a question about what's the best way, like what is the way to do certain things, I just go to Bootstrap, read the source, click around a few things, understand how it's going, and I just copy and paste and steal what they're doing, make it work for whatever I'm doing, and go. And it's like you get all of, I save so much time. I don't have to research things. I just go through, see how they're doing it. I have this confidence to know that they have gone back and forth over months and maybe even years to refine these things. So read source. You don't have to use a project directly to benefit from it. Read their source, understand what they're doing, and borrow their code. That's the whole point of open source. Use open source to improve your team. I love working on teams with people who do open source because I know that they have mastered the challenges of collaboration. When it comes to things like version control, local development setup, automated testing, setting all that crap up, just working in collaboration in general. Like running and participating in open source means you have to understand these things and get them done, or be able to do them in a way that everyone can participate in. So people that participate in open source maybe don't know how to set these things up, but they know what it means to run through these things. They understand how to contribute back. So whenever I set these things up on a project, I don't have to sit down and have a long conversation, explain the basic concepts of version control with somebody. They get it, they understand, they're participating. The best teams that I've worked, or the best people on teams that I work with are people that do open source and are active on GitHub or whatever. They always seem to know how to do things, and we just work so seamlessly together. And then problem solving, long distance, problem solving and coming up with ideas in a threaded conversation and weighing pros and cons in such a dry environment as a GitHub thread. If you can do that and you can come up with a logical way to do things, then let's work together. So there's that. Improve your team. Questions? Cool. So how to get started?
You are looking at source. What exactly are you thinking at the time? Is it just more just a particular piece of code I'm curious about? It's how can I compare this to what I know? How do you approach looking at the source code and trying to modify?
Yeah, so the question is, how do you look at source code? How do you even begin to look at source code and understand what's the process that I go through when looking at somebody else's source code? So you usually start with a problem, you're encountering some issue. You're either in development and you hit a roadblock, you don't understand how something is done, or you're about to tackle an issue, you have some requirements in front of you, oh, geez, I don't know how I'm going to do this. I usually start either on just Google, and I usually get a Stack Overflow question and follow that train down to some project where I can look at the source. Or even if I know sort of the thing that I want to do, I just go to GitHub and search, and then I sort by stars. So whatever project has the most stars, I start there and tick down. And then you just look at, the more that you get comfortable in development and community, you'll start to see signs of okay, this person knows what they're doing. I like the way they're doing it. And I'm going to invest time and look at, the way that they're doing certain things. And I love GitHub. GitHub's great because the one thing that I love about it is the file browser. You can easily go through and drill down, and even have keyboard commands for drilling down through source code. So I can read source really easily on GitHub. Once I find a project that I think is worth investing some time in looking at, you can search it. You can search for keywords within the source code. And you just sort of just do a little bit of sleuthing through the source code and figure out how are they doing it, how are all these different things connected, where does this thing come from, or where does that thing come from, where does this thing come from, and how it's all connected and why they're doing things. And the why too is very important. So if you find a bit of code that you think, oh, this is something that I'm interested in, I want to understand why it is this way, go to GitHub, plug in some keywords. And on GitHub, you can actually, when you search, it'll search the code, but you also have a tab to search the issues. And if those keywords show up in issues, it'll show up in a result. So you can go through the issues that people have, or the bugs that people have reported, or the conversations that people have had around a specific thing, and you can track conversation there. So it's really just like a lot of reading, a lot of sleuthing around through source and through conversations. But GitHub has great search tools for that too.
Talking about bootstrapping, it's in version 4 is an alpha, and it's all Flexbox.
Yeah, Flexbox is, and that's an interesting thing too, is the power that certain open source projects, the community as a large group of developers or people can say, we're no longer going to support browser X. I remember in I think it was 2012 when Jquery said, we're no longer going to support IE 8. And I was at the conference, at Jquery conference, when they announced that, and I couldn't wait to get back to resource and be like, to all my project managers and client managers, like, we're no longer supporting it. Jquery doesn't support it. I don't have to support it anymore. But the reality is like that, like Jquery is just an open source project run by a core group of people, and as a collective, they've like made the decision, we don't want this in our source code anymore. We're not going to support it. And now, how many people support IE8, right? Like nobody. And I think part of that is decisions by teams like the HTML5 boilerplate and Jquery and Bootstrap to say this is no longer relevant, we're not going to support it. And then you can easily make that argument up to the people in charge. So like Bootstrap uses Flexbox, which is a CSS3 layout model, which barely has support in IE9. And that's like the standard now. So now if you use Bootstrap, you don't support IE9. That's just it. Yeah, it's not fully supported in IE10, and I don't even know if it's supported in Edge. Yeah, it's not at all in 9? Okay, so it's not even supported at all in 9. Okay. Yeah, they had some like weird implementation of it. So anyway, yeah, that's a good point too, is like open source. If you don't want to support a technology, if you're tired of supporting IE8, go to the tools that you use and listen to what they're saying and make arguments against supporting something, and you can no longer have to support IE8. Anything else? Cool. So start with projects to get started. Find projects that you use every day, projects that interest you. And yeah, search for starred repos if you're interested. If you're looking for a project to use, go to GitHub, search for projects. Find ones that have lots of stars. If you find a project on GitHub that you like, give it a star. That helps people discover it. So start there. Start with issues. Get really familiar with GitHub issues. I'm just gonna assume that we're all using GitHub because GitHub's ubiquitous at this point for open source. But yeah, read through threads. See how people are talking about the software. Add comments. Feel free to comment. Vote for a feature. A lot of times if I'm searching for something and I stumble across a thread where the creator of the project's like, yeah, we want to do this, but it's not there yet, I just go +1, like, add this feature. And it lets the creator of the project know, like, people are interested in this thing. We should, like, work on it. If you're silent, no one's going to know that you want that thing implemented. And if you find a bug, open an issue. It's super easy. They're super disposable. If the creator wants to ignore you, they'll ignore you. They can close it. But let it be known if you encounter an issue, just log it. Log an issue. It's painless. Step up from there. Read through source, like we talked about. Download the source. Run it on your computer. Run tests on your computer. If the project has an automated test suite, get familiar with how to run a project locally. Write your own tests. You don't have to pull it back into the main project, but just fiddle around with the thing. Make some tests fail. Get familiar with how the project is set up and configured and how you can contribute. You can disregard your changes after you're done, but feel free, pull it on a project, play around with it, understand it. And then you can start writing code and start small. Find small bugs if you encounter a bug. Or if you encounter something that you wish a project had, take a stab at doing it. Fork the repo, create a branch, do your changes, and then submit a pull request. I'm gonna take a second too, just so that, who has heard of the concept of a pull request before in code? Cool. So for the uninitiated, I'll give a very brief example of what this is. So in,
Can you enlarge this a little bit?
yes. Cool. So this is, I have a couple pull requests out on my, the project that I run now. So hopefully we're all a little bit familiar with the concept of like version control, to where like you have save points with your project, or commits as they're known in Git. So every time you make a change and save it, it's called a commit. And then you have branches. You have different streams of development that you can have on a project. If somebody wants to contribute to your project, they can fork off of your project at a certain point, and they can do their own work. And then once they're ready to have that work pulled back in or merged into the main line of development that everybody else gets to see, they do what's called a pull, or they request that you pull their code into the main line of commits. So it's like you have your commits, somebody branches out, they do some work, and they say, hey, is this cool? Can I pull this in? They do a pull request. They're requesting that you pull in your code. And GitHub gives you a really cool interface into this. So this person here has created a fork, and then they went into GitHub and they said, I want to open this pull request. So I can click here on it. He's given a little bit of examples of like, here's what it is. This is a really good pull request, by the way. He provides some images, some code examples for the thing. GitHub gives you a tab here where you can look at all the things that the person has changed, and you can comment directly on a line. So I can like add a comment. I can add a comment here, and we can have a threaded conversation about a specific line of code, which is super helpful. You can see here we've had a little bit of back and forth on this thing. This guy said +1, very nice. Let's get this in. I gave him some feedback on the item. Some other people chipped in their 2 cents. We have this like really nice like back and forth conversation about like what is the best way to integrate this piece of code. And right away too, I have my my code set up on a tool called Travis, continuous integration, which will do some I guess it's called like a ghost merge. Like it determines whether or not the code can be merged, and GitHub shows me whether or not all my tests pass, and whether or not the code can be integrated. So this is an interface I encourage you to get very familiar with. It's easy. GitHub has lots of instructions on how to do pull requests, but you know it's a completely easy to use interface. Great for having conversations with people and giving feedback. So there's that.
I have another question.
Yeah.
It's basically a social network, and obviously you have to gather an audience per se. How is it just putting your projects up and putting your main projects up, and that really attracts attention? Or is there other ways you can attract?
Yeah, I mean, so like, so this is kind of interesting. So when I Dynamit, because I do things on company time, you know, like they own it. So we started a GitHub organization. GitHub has this concept of organizations. So GitHub, you can go to the Dynamit organization, and I can join it as an employee. And anything that I do there, I say, hey, do you guys want to open source this? And they go, sure. And so we throw it up on the Dynamit GitHub account. And so that's one way, is to, as an organization, you can promote. You can say, here's all of our projects. Like you can go to github.com/dynamit and see all of the projects that we've open sourced. And we tweet that out whenever we open source something. So you just drum up traffic, and making sure that you title your project accordingly, add good descriptions, publish it to the appropriate places. You can get some attention. A lot of times we do things, we just open source things because we're like, this was interesting. It's not necessarily something we want to like people to use. But like we did a microsite, or I did a microsite using React. That was like an isomorphic type thing that I had never done before. And I was like, we can just open source this and let other people look at it and see like if they want to borrow some of these concepts. So we just like, hey, here's the source code for this thing. We're not monetizing it. It's just like something we did internally. Here it is. And then you can publish your own things under your own account. It's free. GitHub.
I'm not exactly a large-sized company per se. I'm just one person that's developing a small product.
Yeah.
So, I mean, how would you be just an individual? How would you be able to attract attention? You know, hey, I think you could take a look at this. I've been
Oh, yeah.
at this for 3 days, and my eyes about to roll out my sides.
Yeah.
Like, what would you do as an individual to gather some of that attention?
Yeah. So one way that I've done it with Fabricator is like there's people are usually writing about and blogs or whatever some of the ideas that you're working with. So like for Fabricator, it was style guides and like automating the style guide process. So I just like on a comment, I was like, hey, I do the same thing with Fabricator. Take a look. And over time, people have come to it and they chip in their 2 cents. A lot of the early contributors were people that I worked with, which might be hard for you if you don't have employees around you. But I'm sure anybody in the Columbus Web Group or on RAD, if you're a member of RAD. If you're not a member of RAD, join RAD on Facebook. See Kevin or Adam or me, and we can add you to RAD. But you just put like on Facebook. We have was it Really Awesome Developers?
It was originally ridiculously awesome.
Okay.
But then I think everyone voted for Really Awesome Developers.
Okay.
Ridiculously Awesome Developers was one of the options.
Okay, so we're Really Awesome Developers, and it's just like a developer. We're just like friends that are all developers. And I post stuff on there sometimes. It's like, hey, take a look at this thing that I did. And Kevin does that, and that's a good way because people are generally more apt to like give feedback to people that they have some acquaintance to, is rather just like random. So yeah, reach out on social networks. If you're using a library that somebody has published on open source as part of your project, like get involved in their community and do cross links from your repo, like mention issues that you've logged in your project and other issues. GitHub's really great at that. You can cross-reference projects and issues from project to project, and it will form links from project to project to project. And that provides a pathway for people to discover your project. I do it all the time with Fabricator. If I'm using a project, hey, I had this issue, and issue number 20 on Fabricator, and here's how I solved it. And people come to my project through that.
Okay.
Yeah. So lastly, running a project. Like I said, I run Fabricator, which is a small little open source project, and I've learned a few things from it. The first thing is choose a good license. The licenses do matter, and the licenses of the things that you use also matter. I want to talk about the three big ones that are probably in your purview of something to select. And I heard it said that licenses sort of tip you off as to what the person is afraid of. So if you're afraid of just being held liable for something, choose MIT. MIT is like really permissive. It's like do whatever you want with it, but I'm not responsible for anything if it breaks. The next one is Apache, which is really similar to the terms of MIT, which is really permissive, but it has some protections against patent lawsuits. So for instance, if you write a library and release it under Apache, and somebody uses your library on some project, and then they have their work patented, and they try to turn around and sue you for patent infringement because the stuff that you did is technically covered by the patent that they were granted. Apache says you can't sue me if you decide to patent a product that consumes my library. You can't do it, and if you do try to sue me, you immediately lose the privilege to use my library. So Apache is a good option if you're afraid of being sued. A lot of corporations choose that one. And then GPL. If you're afraid of your software being used in a commercial or proprietary product or being monetized and not open sourced, choose GPL. That's the one that Richard Stallman helped set up. And the terms of that is basically you can somebody can use your project, but if they use it, they can use it and they can sell the thing that they use afterward, but they have to open source. So if I write a library that's covered under GPL and you consume it, you have to open source the project that consumes it. You can sell it, but it has to be open source. You have to distribute the source code. Any questions on licenses? And like adding a license, I thought there would, like, honestly, it's like you just put the license in the source code. You add a license file or you put it at the top of your document, and that is like the way that you apply a license to your work. Utilize free tools. There's tons of free tools at your disposal. The community is really active in helping project owners promote and maintain their products. So GitHub, obviously, which is built on the open source version control software Git, is a free thing. They have some paid tiers, but for everyone, completely open and unprotected is free, or unprivate is free. Package managers like NPM for Node, Composer for PHP Bundler are great ways to distribute your projects. Travis CI, Travis Continuous Integration, is a great continuous integration service that's free, has great integrations to GitHub. I use it to run tests, but you can run it to deploy to different environments. Super robust, very much free. And then shields.io. If you've ever seen on a GitHub project where they have like the little tests passing or the version number, there's little like images that are badges. There's this site shields.io is like this massive collection of all of those things that you can add to a project. I won't flip over, but if you go to if you're active on GitHub, if you look at any GitHub project, most of them have those like little shields. That's where you get it, shields.io. Listen to the people that are using your code. And you have to be active. So obviously, like if you're a GitHub owner of a project and somebody files an issue, I have it set up, it sends me an email. Listen to people when they submit issues. Don't just like don't release something out there, even if it's just like, hey, this is a proof of concept. Don't turn a deaf ear. If you release something and you don't listen to ideas and engage with people, you're only doing part of the job of open source. You're releasing it out there and you're just talking and you're not listening and you're not growing. People will give feedback. Some of it's good, some of it's bad, but listen to people. There's a project, a free service called Gitter. Has anyone ever used Gitter before? So it's a really cool service. I use it on Fabricator. It's great for projects that are a little bit larger. It's like Slack or HipChat, but for GitHub repositories. So I have a little Gitter shield or badge on my project, and people click on that, and they're immediately thrown into a chat room, like an IRC chat room, but it looks better and it's easier to use than IRC. And they just talk about issues, and I log in like once or twice a day. And sometimes somebody has like posted a comment, and I just have like a really quick conversation with this person about how to do X, Y, and Z, or have a conversation about, here's an idea that I had, let's talk through it. And Gitter, it's free once a day. If you're on a little bit of a larger project, use it. Some of the bigger projects are starting to adopt Gitter over IRC, which is pretty cool because it's a nice interface. But use that, and then use Twitter too. Set up some filters, do a search for your project name, and people tweet about Fabricator all the time, and I just like star it or respond to them and say, hey, this is cool, or they ask questions, and I wouldn't hear that if I wasn't listening on Twitter. So if you get a project that starts to get some traction, just set up a simple Twitter alert and listen to people. Have a low barrier to entry, and I can't stress this enough. Help people use your code. Provide good instructions for getting set up. Don't just release something and assume people understand how to get it up and running on their machine locally, because that can be a challenge. Write documentation, and not only in like Markdown format or whatever on GitHub, but also write it in your code. Write really good, well-commented code, because that's going to help other people understand your thought process and how to do things. And comments are like disposable. They're there and then they're gone when you compress or compile things. So Don't be afraid to add comments. Nothing's more frustrating than reading a project or trying to contribute on a project where there's no comments and you don't understand why something is the way that it is. And provide tests too, which can be helpful. If your project starts to scale, more people try to contribute, add testing, automated testing around that. Be a good steward of your project. And I like this idea of like, you own the project. Ultimately, like you have the say, or your organization has the say as to like what gets done. But if you're going to be an open source, you have to listen to other people's ideas. You have to be open-minded, right, about the ideas that people have or the way that people are using your software. People use my project all the time in ways that I didn't think, or they come up and they constantly ask me for things that I didn't initially think about or are resistant to. And I've added those features in, and the product is better because of that. And not because of, if it was up to me, I wouldn't have added those features or changed the development path the way that it was, but because people vocalize their opinions and I listen to it, I think the product is better because of that. So ask for input. Always, always, always ask for input on things. And to go along with that, don't merge your unreviewed code. And it's harder when it's just you. And I understand that, but if you have just one other person, a friend, at the beginning, like have somebody look at your code and give you feedback on it, you will benefit from that immensely. If you operate in a vacuum and you develop in a vacuum, you're not going to grow. Like take advantage of that fully. Provide timely responses. I'm bad at this, but it's really frustrating when I participate in somebody else's project and I submit an issue and I hear nothing for weeks and weeks and weeks and weeks. And it's not even like an important thing, but like it's just I want to hear back. I want to know that you received it. I want to get some input. Or if I do a pull request. So if somebody submits a pull request and you can't get at it, just like let them know I hear you. Here's some ideas, some thoughts. I'm going to try to review it, but give timely responses. Say yes to people, but also say no to people. You're going to get people that want to have ideas for your project that are bad ideas. And it's okay to say, this is a bad idea, here's why I think it's a bad idea, and this is here why I'm not going to do it. But also be open-minded and realize that you're not perfect, you don't have the perfect view on everything, that people are going to have good ideas for your project that you didn't think of initially, and you need to go, okay, is this a good idea, should I do it? Yes, say yes. And give good explanations as to why yes or no you're doing things. So that's all I have. Resources. I'm going to put this up on speaker deck or something and send it out. But yeah. Abby Patinsky. She's a friend of mine. She's a great illustrator. Yeah. So any questions, any comments, anything you guys are interested in? Open source?
What is the most popular open source project?
The most popular one, like of all time?
Yeah, Jquery.
Jquery is probably pretty up there. I think in terms of like ubiquity, it's probably Linux. I mean, like how much of the internet runs on Linux? And how, I mean, like if you look at Apple's open source page, all of the utilities that they borrowed from like the Linux community, the Unix community, there's like Bash. I mean, like how prolific is Bash? Right? It's like on everybody's computer. PHP is a big one. jQuery is up there. Bootstrap's up there. You'd be surprised how many like enterprise, you guys, who uses Bootstrap? Like an application? Yeah, so like probably like half the people in this room use it. It's awesome. I mean, it's like, as a front-end developer, I don't want to use it because I think I can do it better, but to like back, like if I'm working on like more of an application thing, a back-end thing, Bootstrap all the way. Yeah.
No, this is from the top. You mentioned Linux. I had a buddy, he basically, I was describing Ubuntu's great. It's definitely, I think, I don't know what it's all about. The system.
Yeah.
Why did that? Why is it so great? And actually, a lot of times, like, how would you explain to somebody like how it's probably squeezing, of course, when it was Microsoft, double. But what points did you make to say that you should definitely go open source and take
Yeah.
the action into Red Hat or over Windows?
Yeah. So the question is like, what's the argument? Like, why use open source? Like something like Linux over Microsoft or OS? And
I always looked at it as like the difference between a parent and a babysitter. A babysitter, they do a job for money, and there's a certain amount of commitment and passion they bring to that.
yeah,
But a parent, it's an entirely different level. And a lot of people that are work on open source, that's the kind of passion and commitment that they bring
They're like a
to the
parent.
project they're working on. It's not just a job.
yeah,
It's something that they are committed and passionate about, and they will invest all kinds of time and resources and whatever in making it better. When the same thing in a job kind of situation, it's
Yeah.
from my house or whatever the
yeah.
criteria will be, but it's just kind of a different level.
Yeah, there's an author and speaker, Daniel Pink, that talks about the different ways people feel fulfilled in life and in their work. And one of his points is people have to feel like they're masters of whatever they do, like they have skill mastery. And he uses the example of open source as a point to say people will donate their time, will give freely of their time, sometimes even like upwards of 20, 30 hours a week to contribute to something which they will never get a penny for. And that's because they love being part of that, like they love exercising their skills, they love like being like a parent, they love like building that thing, they like mastering their skills. And that drives people, that desire to like have mastery over their skill and feel fulfilled is what drives like a lot of people on open source. The other part of that, which I think is interesting, is how empowered I feel to participate in open source. And I think it goes back to like what Richard Stallman initially hits at, is like if something's not working for me, how empowering is it for me to go, I can just change it. Like, it's frustrating. If you've ever been in a situation, and like Mack used to get a lot of flack over that, flack over how sort of constrained it was, like you couldn't modify it, and how frustrating that was to people. But like an operating system like Linux, or even the utilities in Linux, if something's not working, if there's a bug, you can look at the source and you can fix it yourself. You can make things work the way that you want it to work, and that is very empowering. To know that you can do whatever you want. That's, I think, one thing that attracts us all to being developers is this idea of like you can do whatever you want. You can create something from nothing and have total control over it.
Say another big thing is by it being open, there's a different level of security that arises.
Yep.
As opposed to a limited group of 18, 20, 3,000, whatever developers looking at this thing. And you can literally have hundreds of thousands of people worldwide
Absolutely.
solving these problems with security and other things and whatever.
Somebody shared a link in our Slack channel at work about the Ashley Madison, the leak, and how like these security researchers had like looked at the source code for the site, and there was an instance like 2 years ago where a developer had like stored user passwords as like plain text, a variable in there, and it's like, that doesn't happen. Like, if you submit that in a pull request, no one's gonna accept that, right? And they were able to like extract like some crazy amount of people's like passwords, like unencrypted passwords, just from that like one bad developer decision. And it's stuff like that open source like security, like when people are looking at it and vet it and have full transparency into what's going on, it's very hard to let malicious things or even dumb, lazy things into source code. There's a lot of security that goes along with it.
They may get in, but they won't stay in for long.
Yeah, I mean, like OpenSSL, of course, is like the big one. That there was a big memory leak in that, and that's an open source project, and that leak had been around for 10 years or something crazy like that. Yeah, so.
From opposite end of popular, there was a document management system being used at a thing like Blazers maybe 13 years ago, which was open source technology. It's around still, but the question would be, if someone had one when someone was around that was open source and document management system, looking for things that are open source and like under your like SharePoint
Yeah.
that we could use to as an alternative to anything in the open source community that is sort of popular for that niche.
So was the question? I'm having a hard time because I got the AC right in my head. But is the question?
Are there any decent document management systems these days that are open source?
Oh, geez, I'm sure there are. I have never had the need. I don't know off the top of my head for one, but go to GitHub, search for SharePoint, search for document management systems, sort by stars, and you'll get hits, or you'll start on that path. Yeah.
It's not a question, more of a comment. The slide you talked about, like which other companies are using open source, and we listed Ford there. I just thought that was funny because I was watching some history show one time back in the early 1900s when Henry Ford was trying to start his company. Apparently, somebody else actually held the patent for
Yeah.
the automobile,
Yeah.
but Henry Ford fought it and got the Supreme Court to kind of like open source the patent for automobiles.
Yeah, the two-cylinder engine. Yeah, they opened. Yeah, like back when the automobile industry was, it was like the two-cylinder engine or something like that, and a bunch of like, I think there's like 200 or 300 patents in the automobile realm that all of the automobile manufacturers shared and had full access to. It's like, yeah, and I think he must have had the patent or somebody did, and I don't know the details, but yeah, that's a really interesting. And think about had that not have happened, right? Like where would we be? Like that open access of information. Yeah. So if you're part of an organization, don't be afraid. Like open source does not mean you're not going to make money. Like quite the contrary. Like you can make money off of open source, it's just not in the same ways that you think.
You got to figure too, and I mean, you look at it from a monetary standpoint. I'm going to get this software for free, but there's no free lunch. There's going to be a learning curve. There's going to be hopefully a contribution that you're going to make back to it, to where you're going to take it, you're going to use it for your purposes, your use case, and then you're going to say, well, it's 95% of the way to what I need. And I'm going to contribute this other 5% that brings it all the way to where I want to be, and then contribute that back. And that's part of the compounding effect. The beauty of it is that, if you could start every project 85% of the way done, what does that do to your timeline of bringing something, online? It's just.
Imagine if you had to build Drupal every time you did a site, right? Yeah, I mean, like, was it whitehouse.gov? Is that still on Drupal? Yeah. Open source project, Sony. We have a few projects at Dynamic that are on Drupal. Imagine if you had to recreate that and all of the thought that went behind that over, it's like, what, 7 years old?
Yeah, you go through, you go to WordPress or Drupal or any of these open source kind of projects like this, and you just look at, all the comments and you get arguments that are going on literally for months and years about how's the best way, and something changes in the landscape, and now this Flexbox is now ubiquitous enough that we can go that route. We're going to go that route, and that sort of stuff. It keeps you on the cutting edge of stuff. You're not locked into kind of what a handful of closed-up developers decided 2 years ago. That may be completely outdated by now.
Absolutely.
So I actually used that before.
Oh, nice.
Thank you. But I was wondering, what issues were other tools not solving that you felt the need to create it, or was it more just like a learning thing for you?
Yeah, it was both. It's like I don't know if anybody here is like this, but like you see the way somebody's solving a problem and you're like, that's interesting. I maybe think I can do it better, but I have some time and I want to see what it takes to get there. I want to do the same thing, but in a different way. And so I learned, like from a development standpoint, a tremendous amount just through the process of like building a similar tool from a different perspective and a different technology. So there's that part. There was also things that those tools weren't solving for me. Like I like to learn, but I'm also pragmatic. Like I'm not gonna rewrite something if it doesn't need to be rewritten. And so like for Fabricator, I didn't like the server dependency. I didn't like that like Pattern Lab and some of the other ones were written in PHP. And they required me to run an Apache server locally to get up and running, and I had all that configured. And I didn't like that I had to run PHP and a specific version of PHP on my deployment environment. So I built something that just was a static site generator and used the Node ecosystem, which I'm familiar with and have gotten other developers easily ramped up on. And some of the ways that it had a lot of like design already baked into the thing. And with Fabricator, I just want to be like, there's nothing. Like you start with a blank canvas. There's very few opinions. There's very few style sheets in it initially. And I didn't like, it's like that freedom thing, right? Like I didn't like somebody like defining the way that I had to do something and giving me too much of a starting point, because I feel like I had to go in and like remove a bunch of stuff and like change the way they did things in order to get started. And my concept with Fabricator was like provide just the minimum to be useful and then trust that the developer that's using it will have the freedom and knowledge to use it as they want.
What do you feel about fork projects that kind of go completely off track?
Forked?
I've been doing that with Paragraph actually, and I'm wondering if I should release it. So I don't think it's a pull request, because talk to him about it, and he's not interested.
Yeah.
And it's a complete rewrite, but it's not the version, so it's PHP.
Yeah, I mean, like certain licenses, depends on what license. So like, I think certain licenses don't let you use some of the term, like you can't use the same name as the canonical resource, but like that they put their stuff out there. It's like, it's out there. Like anyone can use it, modify it, change it, redistribute it. That's like the whole point of open source. So if they're not jiving with it, either you're doing something that the rest of the community in there doesn't like, or you're doing something that only works for you and works really well for you, and maybe other people will discover it and get ideas from you, and you'll pick up traction and take over Pattern Lab. The same thing happened with Node recently. If anyone's familiar with Node, like Node forked off 2 different groups, and they just recently resolved and came back. They had 2 incompatible code bases, 2 splinter groups. They sat down, resolved their issues, set up a plan, and then merged everything back in. And now we skipped from Node version 0.12 to version 4 in a day. Yeah. And that's just like it. Node is a great open source success story, like being able to have conversation in the open and resolve issues as a community and go from a fork to one code base. Sure. One more. You good? Yeah.